It's episode 99 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. I can't believe we've made it to almost episode 100. Thank you so much for tuning in all this time. Please go to hankgarner.com, subscribe to the show, and leave a comment that helps other people find it. Also, I hope that you'll visit our sponsors this week. ThirdScribe.com is the one-stop solution for authors. They'll take care of everything for you where you can focus on what you do best, and that's writing. Let them help you showcase your books, help you connect with readers, help you build your mailing list. Everything an author needs to know how to do, ThirdScribe can help. Hey, did you see that Nick Cole released a new story this week? It's called The Pawn in the Portal, and it's a short story in his weird universe that follows up after The Dark Knight. The first story in this arc was called The Red King, then The Dark Knight. This one fills in the gap between The Dark Knight and his next book, which comes out hopefully this summer. Go and pick it up. It's called The Pawn in the Portal. It's by Nick Cole. I'm a huge fan. I know you will be too. Also, I have a new story out this week. I hope you'll go pick it up. It's in Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, Volume 4, and the name of my story is The Hereafter. There's also a story by John Frater, S. Eliot Brandes, and Daniel Arthur Smith. 4 authors of 4 great, weird Twilight Zone type stories for only 99 cents. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, Volume 4, links to all of our great sponsors and things that we'd like for you to try in the show notes. I have another book recommendation for you. It's The White Dragon Genesis by Stefan Boltz. Described as action-packed poetry, this is Stefan Boltz at his best. It's one of those books that leave you desperate for more, says one Amazon reviewer. Highly, highly recommend this jewel of a book. The White Dragon Genesis is a fantastic story, wonderfully developed characters, and an ending that will leave you on edge and begging for Genesis Part 2. Listen to what the author himself has to say about The White Dragon Genesis.
So I wanted to write a book about a dragon that wasn't a book about a dragon, but rather about an 18-year-old girl named Casey Byrne. She's a regular teenager. She's just gotten out of high school. They're having a party on the beach. It's summer solstice. There's the promise of a fulfilled life ahead and a budding relationship, a bright future. But that night marks the beginning of a devastating apocalyptic event. The next 36 hours, we experience it in real time through Casey's eyes, turn her life completely upside down and strip her of everything dear to her. But during that time of terror, of darkness and despair, something inside her awakens. It is gift and curse alike, for it can destroy her or turn her into the most powerful weapon against the evil that has reached the shores of our world.
The White Dragon Genesis by Stefan Boltz is available now at Amazon.com. Find a link in the show notes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Very excited today to have on the show with me R.A. Salvatore, author of the Drizzt Do'Urden series of books, and one of the preeminent fantasy authors writing today. So thank you for coming on the show, Mr. Salvatore.
It's my pleasure. Good to be here.
At the beginning of each show, I ask a variation of the same question, and that question is, how did you first know that you wanted to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, boy. It's funny because it happened twice. First, it happened when I was like a very little kid, like kindergarten, and I would write all these little Snoopy books because I was a big Charlie Brown fan. But then, as I went through school, it beat the love of reading and writing right out of me. And by the time I graduated high school, I was only writing or reading what I needed to get the grades. And I actually started college undeclared, but as a math major with all the courses in math and computer science. Then I read, actually in 1977 for Christmas, my sister gave me a copy of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. And a couple of months later, we had this major blizzard here in New England and shut everything down. I was trapped at my mom's house for a week. No school, nothing. Couldn't get out of the house. And so I read those books like 5 times, and I remembered how much I used to love to read. And I just kept... And so I fell in love with fantasy because I love the escapism, I love the heroic journey, I love the thought that one person could change the world. So I started reading everything I could get my hands on, but there weren't that many fantasy books back in the late 70s and early 80s, and when I ran out of books to read, I just wrote my own. It's really the truth. And I wasn't trying to be a writer. I didn't understand what a writer was at that time. I wasn't trying even to get published. I just wanted to do something so that I could give it to my kids someday, who would give it to my grandkids, so they might have a better idea of who I was. And so it kind of found me. I mean, I was working as a financial analyst when I got my first contract.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating on a couple of levels, on several levels there. One, that school beat the love of reading and writing out of you. I had a similar experience. I have dyslexia, and it was a very tough time in school, and made me really hate reading and writing, especially in front of people. And it took something to bring me out of that, and I love that you had a kind of a similar experience. Well,
I think more similar than you think. I don't know that I have dyslexia, but I know that it can take me a month to read a book. And I have to really care about the book or I just lose my place.
Oh, wow. Yeah, me too. And one thing that I really love about the time we live in is audiobooks are such a huge help. I was just listening to one of yours a couple of days ago, and I loved it that you can just close your eyes and get lost in that world. So what was it about the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings that you said you loved that hero's journey that just resonated with you? Was it his world building? Was it his characters? Was it kind of a mixture of all of it? But what really drew you in?
I used to love The Wind in the Willows, Watership Down. The idea of a book taking me someplace where I couldn't otherwise go, that's what was lost. Because when I was in school, we weren't reading literature much. We were reading like a paragraph of Faulkner in a big textbook.
Right.
And analyzing the paragraph. That's not reading. That's not a novel. That's not getting to feel the characters or understand what the author's trying to get to, and actually what I've learned is getting to understand what the author's trying to get to is a fool's errand anyway. It's more like getting to understand what you get out of the author's journey that he's presenting. But you don't get any of that when you're reading a paragraph in a textbook. So, the way I was taught English in high school, and I had some really great teachers. I had 2 or 3 that I still love to this day. But the whole curriculum, the way it was set up at the time, wasn't conducive for someone like me who I was very busy. I had a lot of other interests. I wasn't reading books on my own at that time, and the things I was being given to read in school were not helping me want to go pick up books and read them. Yeah. I hated it. I hated it.
And it takes, like you said, when you take a paragraph or something from an author, it completely removes the context. An author may take 100,000 words to build a story and an arc for a character, and you're just pulling something completely out of context. And it's really doing a disservice to the author as well as to the student and the reader.
Well, it's even more than that. When I read a book, I like to have friends that are in the book.
Right.
That's why I like buddy fantasy. That's why I write buddy fantasy. In the end of the book, when I closed the last page of The Hobbit, I missed Bilbo. I was sorry it was over. That's what you don't get if you're not reading the whole book. And, yeah, that Christmas present changed my life.
That's amazing.
Because I never would have become a writer. I'd be working right now as a manager, or if I'm lucky, I was lucky, in a high-tech corporation somewhere.
So did you have an aptitude for computer science and that stuff, because there is an inordinate amount of writers that I've had on this podcast and talked to 100 writers, and in fantasy and sci-fi especially, there's a crossing of these paths of writing the speculative fiction and fantasy, and people that are kind of have a more of an aptitude for technology and things like that.
Well, particularly with novelists, a lot of the skills involved in writing a novel are organizational.
True.
Okay, and yes, I find that a lot of the people I know who are writers are also very strong in math science. And my favorite professor in college had a perfect SAT score in math. The idea of being able to compartmentalize, organize, and an outline for a book is almost like a flow chart, and it has to be logical. The beginning, middle, and end of a book have to be a logical progression. That's what makes novels so special. That's why we can never lose the novel as an art form, because novels teach readers how to get from point A to Z logically, if they're done well.
Right. That's a brilliant point, because we hear writing advice from people like Stephen King and folks like that all the time, and they say if you want to be a great writer, you've got to read a lot. You've got to read a lot, and you never, maybe someone who's a beginning writer doesn't exactly know what they mean by that information. Sure, you need to read a lot, but why? And the answer is, one, you need to understand the flow of words and the cadence of dialogue and things like that. But you're absolutely right. Learning to take a character from point A to point B and all of the stops along the way and have it bring some resolution at the end. Yet that's something you really can only learn by reading other people that have done it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, I'm reading all these fantasy books, and I say, well, you should also be reading, young writers I'm talking about, you should also be reading Shakespeare, and you should be reading Twain, and you should be reading James Joyce, and you should be reading Chaucer, and you should be reading Dante, and you should be reading Homer. The classics have stood the test of time. They're important. And anyone who wants to be a writer should be, when people, they say, what should I take? I get a letter every week. I get a letter. I want to be a writer. I'm going to college. What should I take? And I always say the same thing, engineering. And then they come back and say, no, really, I want to be a writer. I'm like, I'm being serious. Because first of all, if you want to be a writer, the best thing you can do for your career is to have a job that pays your bills so that you'll be able to write in your spare time without worrying about paying the electric bill.
Right.
Okay? And second of all, what you need to do in college, or even outside of college and on your own, is take courses in literature. Study literature. You want to be a writer, study literature. You want to be a football player, you watch game films. You want to be a writer, you study literature.
True. When a young novelist wants to be a fantasy writer and they just immerse themselves in fantasy and they don't read outside the genre, what mistakes do those people usually make?
Oh, good question. Well, first of all, if you're writing in fantasy now, it's very different than when I started, because when I started, there wasn't that much of it.
Yeah.
Now it's ubiquitous, right? There's thousands of fantasy books every year. And the tropes have become stronger, and you really ignore them at your peril. I mean, you can make dwarves dance under the stars and elves mine in tunnels and things like that, but all you're really doing is upsetting the reader who has become comfortable with the tropes. So I think it's important that you understand them, and you understand that these are tools that you can use but aren't bound by as a writer. But if you're only reading fantasy books, I think you're limiting. I mean, you look at what, for example, George Martin's done. Game of Thrones is the 100 Years' War, right?
Right.
I mean, he knew that. He pulled it in. And you look at a lot of things that are working so well now in pop culture, shows like Vikings, for example. You've got to read outside of fantasy to understand that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is, whenever I'm creating a civilization, a culture, in one of my books, whether it's the Dark Elves in Menzoberranzan or the societies I created in Demon Wars, the church I created in Demon Wars, those are based on books that weren't fantasy, or on history, if you will. For example, Menzoberranzan and the Dark Elf city in the Dark Elf books, is based on Mario Puzo's The Godfather and the Five Families of New York.
Oh, wow.
Okay?
Love it.
Does it make sense? Does that make sense to you, having read the book?
Yeah, that puts into perspective. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, the Abelican Church in Demon Wars is based very strongly on the Catholic Church, the history of the Catholic Church, and the schism about wealth in the Catholic Church. Only in the Abelican Church, it's about magical gemstones. You have to read outside the genre to understand where most of the genre comes from. Twain's the one that said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I argue that culture rhymes.
Sure.
You can look back, watch the History Channel, learn about ancient Rome, learn about ancient Greece, learn about the Phoenicians, learn about all these varied societies, and you will have ones that, or pieces of them, that logically will flow in to the elven society you're writing in your book. You see?
Yeah, I do. That's
but
brilliant.
If you're only reading fantasy, you're not reading the source material.
Right. So the fantasy is. I think I talked to Dan Wells about this one time, that the fantasy setting is kind of the window dressing for the real story that you want to tell.
Of course. I mean, look, I'm writing about a dark elf. If that dark elf wasn't human in his heart, nobody would relate to him.
Right. It's brilliant.
And yeah, fantasy is the pretty dressing on it, but the book itself is going to read. I mean, look, a perfect example. One of the best shows on television today is Outlander.
Yes.
The Diana Gabaldon series, marvelous series, wonderful writer.
Yes, you had her on the show a few months ago.
If you're watching this show, if you're watching what Ron Moore is doing with Outlander, the fact that it's somebody who was transported back in time matters not at all to the relationships that have developed on the show between the characters. It's a real story, a complicated love story, a complicated political story, a complicated war story that has a fantasy mechanism that created the conflict in the first place. But the conflict in the first place isn't central, isn't the whole thing.
Right.
It's almost a metaphor for everything else going on, as opposed to the reverse. And it's brilliant, and it's wonderful, and it's rich, and it makes you feel like you're in 18th century Scotland.
Right, absolutely. I think that has been one of the most underrated shows for with the fantasy community and with men in general. I think they just kind of dismiss it.
It's really it's a woman perspective show. Women love it.
Right.
I love it too, because it's just really done well. Ron Moore does characters very, very well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots of intrigue and action, and I think it's a very well done show. So let's go back for just a minute to you read those books your sister gave you for Christmas. You were kind of had the spark ignited in you that you this love of reading and these other worlds, and you started seeking out things, but it was hard to find, so you started making your own. How did you go from doing this as a hobby and just kind of exploring your creative side to thinking, you know what, maybe I need to send this out and see if someone's interested in this? How do you go from those 2 points?
Yeah, when I got out of college, and every day my job was to stand on a metal bench next to a big metal table and load lumps of scrap plastic into a grinder. And the most cerebral part of the job was remembering every 20 minutes to change the barrel under the grinder, or I'd get plastic flakes all over the floor. This was my job.
Oh.
And I was a bouncer in nightclubs at night. This was how I was making a living, and I was dying.
Yeah.
So while I was standing there, loading these lumps of plastic into the grinder, I wasn't there. I was writing a book in my head. I was just letting my imagination run wild. And more often than not, I did not change the barrel in time because of that, because I was distracted, but big deal. I just swept the floor after. But
right.
I did it, like I said, I didn't do it to be published. I didn't even think that was possible. I'm a blue-collar kid from a blue-collar town. I was surrounded by people who had worked in the factories all their lives and didn't even want to hear about dreams that went beyond that. There were notable exceptions, my sister, my father, and my mom, people close to me who said, always try to do the best you can, whatever. But blue-collar sensibilities, still have them, never letting go of them, ever. Very real, in the moment. This is life, make the best of it, attitude.
Right.
So I finished the book, and I was kind of happy with it. I thought it was fun. Gave it to some friends to read, and every one of them came back and said, this is really good, you need to publish this. So I hired my sister to type it, because I couldn't type. We weren't taught how to type when I was in high school, unless you were going into business mode, which meant you were going to be a secretary or something. So you were going to college, everything you were going to do being done with a pen and a blue book. You weren't taught to type.
Wow.
So I hired my sister to type it, ran some copies off, sent it to a bunch of publishers, just because I had been told I should publish this. I'm like, well, why not? I can make a little money. What the heck? So I sent it off, and I got horrible rejection letters. And that's what did it for me, because I love it when someone tells me I can't do something, because I will die to prove them wrong. So for the next few years, I got married, the kids came along, I changed jobs, got into a good job working in finance for a high-tech company, but I never stopped writing. I never stopped working on that manuscript. And then when I had it to where I knew what was wrong with it, when I really stood back from it and looked at it, so I went and I fixed it. I worked my butt off for 4 years on it. And finally, in January of 1987, I said, this is now ready to be published. And I sent it to a bunch of places, and one of, again, just out of the Writer's Market, which is a periodical that comes out a couple times a year, and tells you all the editors and what they're looking for and how to submit to various publishers. One of the places I sent it was TSR, not because I was playing Dungeons and Dragons, which I had played many times and was playing, although not very much in 1987, but because they would accept full-time authors back then. And so I sent it, and a couple of months later I got a phone call, and they said, look, we can't publish this book because we don't have room on our schedule, but we've got this new world called The Forgotten Realms. Would you like to audition for a book there? So I said, yes, I did, and I got the second book in the Realms, which became The Crystal Shard. I wrote it in summer of 77. It came out in the fall of 87, excuse me. Came out in the fall of 88, and 27 months later, after the Halfling's Gem came out, I quit my job and became a full-time writer. So in June of 90.
Wow. So this was a new book that you wrote for them after the audition. Is that right?
Right. The first book was a book called Echoes of the Fourth Magic, which I subsequently sold to Penguin. Actually, it was Ace Books at the time.
Okay.
Ace Berkeley, and it came out, and then I got it back years later, and it and the two sequels are published by Del Rey now.
Okay.
So, it's called The Chronicles of Inis, but it's never identified that way. It's a book called Echoes of the Fourth Magic.
Okay.
That was my first book.
And where did the when you were writing that book, after reading Tolkien, and he has these very familiar tropes, like you talked about earlier, that are familiar to all of us now. Did you kind of use his template when you started that first book? How did you get into creating your own?
that book was actually from a short story I had written in high school, and one of the only English classes I liked. And it had a lot of different source material, if you will. It's basically a future our world, that has become more magic-centered because of a war that pretty much wiped out the planet. So it's very different. It's almost entirely human-centric, except for the bad guys. And I think one of the influences on it was an old movie called The Day of the Triffids, actually. That was certainly the short story, had a lot of that in it. So no, it really wasn't Tolkien-centered at all by that point. Because remember, by the time I started writing this, I had moved on. I read Tolkien, but I had also read Brooks, Donaldson, Moorcock. One of my favorites, Fritz Leiber. I love Fafhrd and Grey Mouser. McCaffrey. I read them all. There wasn't that much, so it was easy to read them all back then.
Right. When you wrote the Crystal Shard for them, that began a long relationship that you've had with Dungeons and Dragons, TSR,
Mm-hmm.
Wizards of the Coast. What was that like coming into an organization and writing a book that was built on an existing world and with existing characters, and where kind of rules were already set up? What was that like for you as a pretty new writer, and then coming into such an established existing place?
Well, the realms weren't that established at the time. As a matter of fact, they didn't even have anything printed in the realms at that time. And if you look at the first box set, the gray box set that came out for the game of the Forgotten Realms, there's a massive map with just a few areas that are actually developed. And that was the beauty of the early realms, is all the people coming in, all we were doing was hiding from each other so we could write our own stories. There were no established characters that I used. Elminster and Illustrial and a couple of the other iconic characters in the realms have been mentioned or have made cameos in my books. Very, very rarely, but every now and then. But particularly in the early ones, everybody in there was somebody I created. Nazir Baranzan, I created. The only source material for that were a couple of old D&D modules by Gary Gygax. I think it was Gygax, in Vault of the Drow and Queen of the Demon Web Pits. Some of the old modules. The rest of that I came up with.
Nice. And
so we had a lot of freedom. I still do have a lot of freedom. Every now and then they'll ask me, can you put this in your book? And yes, sometimes it gets a little heavy-handed on their part, and I push back, and I find ways around what they're telling me to do. But it's really writing the same thing. The difference is I don't have to define the boundaries of a magic system, for example, because that's there in the game.
Right.
So sometimes it can be restrictive, but other times it saves me a lot of the dressing on the cake being the book, right?
Right.
So, I've written 38, maybe, Drizzt Forgotten Realms books.
Wow.
But I've also written 20-something books outside of the realms.
Man.
So it's really not that different. It's more work outside of the realms because I'm creating the whole world.
Right. Is there
but
ever
the process itself is pretty much the same.
Is there ever the temptation when you're writing outside the realms to just completely turn everything on its head because you want to kind of shake up the typical tropes and things like that you're used to using?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And if you've read my Demon Wars books, for example, don't get attached to anyone because, the first Demon War book came out the same year as the Game of Thrones. 96, I think, or 95. That was the year Game of Thrones. And I don't know what was in the air then. It seemed like writers were in a really vicious mood because a lot of beloved characters don't get very far in those series. So, yeah, I don't want to turn the tropes on their head for the sake of the tropes.
Right.
And I've seen authors do that. I've read books where they've got these new wonderful monsters, and when you take away the shell, they're orcs. Okay? So I think people get hung up too much on those kind of superficial issues, like what does an orc look like, or is it an orc or a bug? Well, but they act the same. They are the same. Their purpose in the story is the same. Changing the name doesn't change the trope. And like in Demon Wars, for example, they're dwarves, but they're Powries. They're the bloody caps of folklore. They're not nice people. They're really not nice people. Like, they kill you so they can dip their berets in your blood. They're really not nice people. So I play with folklore all over the place. I do it whether I'm working on a video game or, I use history, legend, and folklore as my basis for almost everything I do.
Fantasy has become extremely mainstream over the last several years, and Dungeons and Dragons and this whole system has become pretty mainstream. You came in at 87, I think, when you wrote that first book.
87, my first contract, yeah.
Yeah. So at that time, I remember as a teenager there, as a late teenager, that Dungeons and Dragons was extremely popular, but there was also a lot of controversy around it. And what was it like for you at that time, coming in as a new author? And were there any things that you remember that stand out to you that was challenging, and writing these stories that you knew had to do with one thing, but there's a whole audience out there that just believes that you're just fanning the flames of tearing down society.
Yeah. My first television interview, local TV, back when they had local cable, was a big deal, right?
Right.
My first television interview, I walk in, and I'm 29 years old, or 30. I was probably 29, and I'm terrified because I'm a shy guy. I really am. I'm an introvert. I gain my strength alone.
Yeah.
I don't, I can go out to a convention and put on a good show for 3 days and have big crowds and everybody's happy and we have a good time. And then I go home and crawl around for a week because I'm exhausted from it.
I think a lot of writers are that way.
I think so, yeah. And so I hide it very well because, again, I don't give a shit anymore, so that's too bad. Right. I hope I could say that on the radio or whatever, whatever. Sorry.
Feel free. No, you're fine.
So I go on TV, and I remember I was wearing a suit and tie, which is like, who died or who's getting married, because that's the only time you'll ever see me in a suit and tie. Right. But at the time I was working in finance, so I had plenty of them. I had to, Right. So I was terrified because I'm on TV. What the heck is this, right? And the woman, who's older than me by probably at the time 25 years. She was in her 50s, I think, if I remember right. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm not insulting her. But anyway, I come on the show, and I walk out under the glare of these spotlights in this little backroom production for local TV, and I sit down, and I thought this was like Local Author Makes Good. I had a book that came out, was on bestseller lists. I thought it was a Local Guy Makes Good interview, and the first thing she hits me with is, so about people summoning demons because of this Dungeons and Dragons game.
Oh, man.
I was terrified. I had no idea. I think I said something along the lines of, yeah, that's really stupid. I don't know. I remember those fights. I remember there was a guy, I think it was someone in Minnesota, who actually ran his campaign on, D&D is evil or something. Look, it just gave me more reasons to laugh at people, so I do it.
Right. Oh, man. So you've had this character.
Wait. Here, I'm sorry. Another one. You got to hear this one. I just thought of this. Soon after I got published, I get a call from one of my aunts, whose nephew on her husband's side of the family is going to Fitchburg State, and he wants to know if I'll come and meet him and his friends. So I do. I love this aunt. I love the family. I go and meet Mike Ledger and Jim and Chris and the other guys. We become fast friends. We're not really related, but close enough. They're really cool guys. They join my Dungeons and Dragons group. A couple of years later, we're talking about this same thing. And in the town next to mine, Fitchburg, Mass. at the time, there had been an incident where they found some runes that they were convinced there was a devil cult in Fitchburg. People were being warned not to let their pets out at night because their cats and dogs would be sacrificed and all this other stuff. Because they found candle wax and they found runes there. And they had this guy who had been on Phil Donahue. He was like an expert in demonology and demonic cults and devil worship and all this other stuff. He was actually in town. In the front page of the papers talking about this and warning people. And I mentioned it at the D&D game. Yeah, I remember when we had the devil cult in Fitchburg or whatever, and all four of the guys got really like funny looks on their face, and they just kind of put their heads down and were chuckling a little bit. It turns out that one of the guys, he's like my best friend in the world now, we're still together. He still plays in my D&D group. He's kind of a sheepish guy. He's kind of an Eeyore at times. He's the most wonderful person in the world, but he can be kind of an Eeyore, you know? Well, they wanted to get him. So one of them drove him up to these rocks in this town, where the other two had written all these, like, runes on the rocks, and put their candles out, and came out like they were, this cult, to scare him. And they scared him all right, and he jumped out of the truck and attacked them, and they had to pull him off because he, flipped out. But anyway, the next thing they know, it's all over the papers that there's a demonic cult in town. And it was just three guys messing with their buddy.
Oh, my gosh. And just spread like wildfire.
And by the way, three of them had been altar boys just a few years before. These were Roman Catholic, good college kids, fun-loving guys who never caused a problem in their lives. And now they're reading on the newspapers about a demonic cult because of a stunt they pulled on one of their friends. Just perfect.
It's perfect. I love it. Oh, man. Well, I hope we've grown past some of that these days.
No, we haven't. And anytime you think we've grown past it, we'll have another national election in 4 years, and you can be reminded again that no, we haven't.
Right. You're absolutely right. You're right. Oh. So you have this character, Drizzt Do'Urden, that has been with you for quite a while. Where did Drizzt come
1987.
from? Where did he come from?
Off the top of my head. Drizzt came off the top of my head. What happened was I had turned in the outline for a book called The Tyrant of Icewind Dale, which became The Crystal Shard, when I was auditioning. And I thought the Forgotten Realms were the Moonshae Isles, because the only printed material that they sent me were Doug Niles' book, Dark Walker on Moonshae, which was the first Forgotten Realms book. Well, the map in that book just showed these three little islands. So I thought this was really a restrictive world, because I didn't know there was this whole Forgotten Realms next to it, this gigantic world next to it. I thought it was just these three islands. So I thought they wanted me to use Doug's characters, which I didn't want to do.
Right.
So I used one of Doug's characters to introduce the hero of my book, Wolfgar. Well, I sent that in, and I won the audition, and the editor, Mary Kirchhoff, said to me, well, we got a problem. And I'm like, she said, well, no, we don't want you to do the sequel. We don't want you in the Moonshae Isles. And I looked at the map, and I said, you want me in the water? Oh, we didn't send you the maps. So they sent me all the maps and everything. We relocated the book after, it took a couple of weeks for me to find a spot in the realms where no one else was going to bother me. And I could just do my thing.
Yeah. And
I created Icewind Dale up in the top northwestern corner of the realms. So then I got a call from Mary one day, and she says, I got a problem. I got to go to a sales meeting. I'm at work. I'm still working in finance. I got to go to a sales meeting and convince the sales force about how good your book is, but we can't use Doug's character. And I said, don't want to use Doug's character. She goes, yeah, but the sample chapter has Doug's character in it. I need a sidekick for Wolfgar. And I said, all right, I'll get back to you in about a week. Give me a few days. She said, no, I got to go to a meeting, and I need a sidekick for Wolfgar. I looked at the clock. It was almost lunchtime. I said, okay, I won't do lunch. I'll call you. Instead of taking a lunch, I'll get to work, and I'll come up with a character, and I'll call you this afternoon. She said, you don't seem to understand. I'm across the hall from the room where the meeting has already started.
Oh, crap.
And I got to get in there. And off the top of my head, I said a black elf. They were called black elves back then. Yeah. There was a long pause, and she says, a drow. And now I'm starting to think, no, I never played them in a game or anything. Wild dark elves in my game. We still don't. And I says, yeah, a drow ranger. I'm thinking, I'm thinking out loud, a drow. Yeah, that'd be cool. Oh, a drow ranger. Nobody's done that before. Because I know drow can fight with both hands, and rangers can fight with both hands, or supposedly get, Anyway, I'm just trying to put 2 and 23 together and get 4 here. And so I'm like, yeah, a drow ranger. That'll be cool, and on and on and on and on. A drow ranger. Yeah, no one's ever done that before. Bob, there's probably a reason no one's done that before. I'm like, no, I can make it work. This will be cool. Now I'm thinking and I'm enjoying it. And she goes, all right, well, since it's just a sidekick character, I'll let you get away with it. What's his name? And off the top of my head, I said, Drizzt Do'Urden of Dammon the Shesbanon, the Ninth House of Menza Baranzan. And she said, what? And I said, I have no idea. And she said, what's Menza Baranzan? I said, I'm thinking it must be a city. And she's like, can you spell all of that? And I said, not a chance. And that's how Drizzt was born. It was just off the top of my head. And it was just a sidekick character. But then I started writing the Crystal Shard. And the first scene I went to write after that call was Drizzt running across the tundra when he gets jumped by some Yetis. If you remember the beginning of the Crystal Shard.
Oh, absolutely.
And I knew, like 2 pages in, I knew this. It wasn't Wolfgar's book. It was his. This was his book. And I don't know why. I don't know how. I'm really glad it happened.
It's just one of those...
exactly how it happened.
One of those pieces of serendipity that just drops in on you. And,
absolutely. Maybe there is magic in the world. I don't know.
Maybe there is. So, Drizzt has been quite the character to have lasted, almost 30 years now in continuing publication. That's amazing. Is it hard to keep a character alive that long and to have so many published stories for him to? How do you keep the character fresh and his adventures fresh?
Well, I think I'll let the readers decide. And if they read the new series Homecoming with Archmage, and now the book that just came out, Maestro and Hero, which is coming out this fall, I think you'll see that, I mean, from my perspective, these are 3 of the best books I've ever written. The character has moved further in these 3 books than I ever thought possible, and I'll just let that speak for itself. I write Drizzt, it's like talking to an old friend. Yeah. I could do it for the rest of my life. Wow. I've often said he's who I wish I had the courage to be.
I love that.
I love the guy. I love the stories. It's the only time I think it got hard for me was there was a little resentment, honestly, that the things I was doing outside the realms, like Demon Wars, which to me Demon Wars is as good as anything I've ever done. I mean, I love those books. There's 11 books there now. I'm going back to it again very soon. The 11 books and a novella. I love Demon Wars. I love what I accomplished there. I feel better about that, or as good about that as anything I've ever done in my life. And I think I was a little resentful that a lot of the Drizzt readers wouldn't go and read Demon Wars. So I got to pull them one at a time by the nose, come here, try this. And so I think at that point, it got a little harder to write Drizzt. This was probably late 90s. Okay. And also I'd had a nasty breakup with TSR at the time over some creative differences, and they were trying to kind of over-control what I could write, and I didn't really want to have anything to do with that. And so, frame of mind of the writer is the second most critical piece of a book, frame of mind of the reader being the first. And I think there have been times over that period where I just didn't want to accept that no matter what else I did in my life, it was going to be hard for me to get more people to care about it than cared about Drizzt. So in a weird way, the success of the Dark Elf almost made me resentful of the Dark Elf, because there were other things I wanted to create.
Right.
And it wasn't until we did the Legend of Drizzt, the collected stories, the anthology of all the short stories I had written over the years, when I finally figured all of this out. What happened was I had to go back and read all the stories. I generally don't go back and reread my work. It's painful to me to do that, because I'm editing again. I wish I had done this. I want to do this instead. I want to do this. You can't write like that, because you'll never be satisfied.
Right.
But I had to go back and reread these short stories because they wanted me to give them a page or two about what my mindset was, why I wrote the story, what I was trying to do. And so when I started rereading these stories, it was like looking at a photo album, an old photo album. It just brought me back to the time and place where I was emotionally, with my family, what house we were living in, our apartment. It was like looking at old pictures, like finding a photo album in your mom's attic and thumbing through. And it was just this walk back through at that time, about 23 years of my life. From getting married to having little kids to now having this career, my kids in college and older,
Right.
And that's when I finally figured it out. Writing isn't what I do. It's my journey. It's my way of making sense of the world. And so whether it's Drizzt or Elbrian or Branson or Jeff Del Judas and Echoes of the Fourth Magic, this is how I get through the day. This is my journey. And
that's awesome.
That's when I stopped ever worrying about the other things like that. There's no way it can't be fresh to me, because every day I wake up and there are new feelings and new challenges and a new way of looking at the world. This is who we are. I'm not the same person I was. I'm 57 years old. I was 28 when I wrote the Drizzt book. I'm not the same person I was when I was 28. When I was 28, I knew everything. Now I'm 57 and I know nothing.
Right.
So,
man.
That anthology clarified for me what this was all about. That, and I watched, you remember the old Behind the Music they used to do on VH1?
Yeah.
I love that series. I love that series.
Yeah.
Well, I saw one about John Fogerty. And he was talking about how for years he wouldn't play Creedence Clearwater Revival songs because of the nasty breakup and some contractual stupidity. But he played them. He started playing them again, and they were talking about why. And he said, because at that point I realized it wasn't about me. It was about them. It's not about me. It's about the people who were there to see me. They want to hear those songs. I owe it to them to give them to them. And when I saw that, which was before I did the anthology, this was probably 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, that's when I stopped resenting Drizzt's success. Because instead of worrying about whether or not somebody reading a Drizzt book would come over and read Demon Wars, instead what I started was being more appreciative that they were reading anything I was writing.
Right.
And realizing how much of a blessing that is to me, to be the privilege of being allowed into somebody else's life for a few hours.
Yeah.
So, to answer your question in the short way, there were times when it became difficult, but those times when it became difficult were more because of my own internal confusion.
Sure. And that's all part of our writer's journey that you talked about. It's it's very, very rarely a linear point A to point B journey. There's all sorts of stuff that goes on in there.
Oh, absolutely. And every overnight sensation took 10 years typically to become an overnight sensation.
That's right. You've mentioned several times your family. How instrumental were they in your early writing and giving you the freedom to pursue something that may or may not ever turn into anything?
Well, my sister gave me the books, and she's always been a huge support. My dad was always a big supporter. One of my great regrets is that he never lived to see me published. But really the person I think that's been there all along has been my wife, Diane. She was my girlfriend when I was working in those plastic factories, and I ran out of books to read and threatened to write my own, and she's the one that said to me, you've been threatening to write this book for a long time, why don't you just do it? And she would actually come over to see me, but if I was writing, she'd hang out downstairs with my dad and watch the Red Sox or something. It wouldn't even bother me. I'd come downstairs. Was Diane here? Yeah, she left. She said she'll see you tomorrow. So she's always been there. And when the kids were little, she'd find, when I got my first contract in summer of '87, we had a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. She was 7 months pregnant. We needed a new apartment because our apartment was too small for 3 kids. And plus, they had just put a crisis center in the same building, which really wasn't a great idea with families living there. And I needed a new car because you can't put 3 car seats in the back of a Mustang GT, no matter how hard you try. So, at this time, I get this offer of a contract, but I'm working 8 hours a day, an hour from home. So I'm gone 10.5 hours a day. Wow. But Diane was the one who would make sure that, either it was at night after I put the kids in bed that I would do my writing, or on the weekends she would take the kids. She was 7, 8 months pregnant, 2 little kids by the hand, and go to the park so I could have some hours to write. So, yeah, I never could have done it without that kind of support.
Right. You have had like we said, a almost 30-year career. From having the Crystal Shard published. I guess next year will be 30 years for you. And you have been extremely prolific. We talked about the 40-some-odd Drizzt books, and then would you say 20 or 30 outside?
I've done in the high 50s. I think I've done like 57 or 58 books total.
So that's more than one book a year. Probably 2 books a year.
It was 3 for a while.
Yeah. How do you maintain that sort of output?
Well,
what is your process like?
First of all, you have to understand that writing sequels is very different than recreating the wheel every time. Writing the first Demon Wars book was a lot harder, where I had to create the whole world and all the characters, than writing the 14th Drizzt book in terms of time, because I know the characters. I know who they are. I know what to expect from them. And so all I really have to figure out is how to move them to another level, how to get them into situations that will put them under physical and emotional stress so I can learn new truth about them. So I don't even approach the Dark Elf books as if I'm writing another novel. To me, it's more like writing another season of television for an ongoing TV show. And I structured the Drizzt books, and I did it purposely from the very beginning. Well, it wasn't purposely, but it was because I didn't get a contract for a trilogy. I got a contract to do a book. And when that book did well, they asked me for another book, Streams of Silver. When that book did well, they asked me for another book. Then they asked me for a prequel trilogy. Because of that, I've been writing the books all along, more along the lines of James Bond or Sherlock Holmes than the way George Martin's doing Game of Thrones or Robert Jordan did Wheel of Time, where it's not, so the story doesn't continually build, drop off all these old ones and continually build characters, and it's really the story of this group of friends and now enemies that has expanded over the years, walking down the road of adventure, and what's the next logical adventure for them. So it's very different. There's no way I could write 55 or 58 or whatever it is, books with 58 different sets of characters.
Right.
There's just no way. But that's not what I've done. You know, there are 11 Demon Wars books. There are 33, I think, Drizzt books. There are 5 Cleric books. So, when you put it more in perspective, more in that perspective, I should say, it explains, I think, how and why I've been able to do it with this level. And I mean, I'm not the only one. I mean, Kevin Anderson does it. So many writers have nowadays, to make a living as a writer nowadays, you really have to be pumping out lots of books.
Right.
It's just the economics of it. I mean, you know, then you get someone like George Martin who doesn't need to anymore.
Right.
But George Martin was
he's got that other kind
writer.
of money.
He was quite a prolific writer himself through the 70s and the 80s, writing TV, writing wild cards, writing... I mean, Robert Jordan used to write Conan novels.
Right.
So, you know, I mean, if you're doing it as a professional, it's your job. Sit down and write.
Right. So a lot of people know you for your Drizzt books, but Demon Wars you mentioned is some of your favorite writing. What would you tell people that are familiar with your Dungeons and Dragons work and your Drizzt? What would you tell them is different about Demon Wars and why they should pick those books up as well?
Well, Demon Wars is a bigger story. I'm not hiding from other creatives in the world. I am the creator of the world. If I want to blow up a city, I'll blow up a city. I don't need anyone's permission. If I want to kill a character, I'll kill a character. And I'm more likely to do that because I have a reservoir of other characters that I've created that I can bring in. It's also, I think the story itself is bigger. It takes on... The Drizzt books have kind of grown up to where the Demon Wars books always were. Like, I have no trouble giving Homeland or the Crystal Shard to an 11-year-old who's a good reader. Yeah. But I wouldn't give The Demon Awakens to an 11-year-old. He wouldn't get it. So I was, you know, by the time I wrote Demon Wars, I'd already written a dozen novels, or more, probably more. So my craft was more polished, and I had an idea for this world and this story that I was able to work on from conception to birth to the long journey of its life that's still going on. So, I mean, I spent 6 months just building the world before I started writing the first book.
Nice.
And with all of that, I think you will see, as a reader of mine, I try to keep the characters true to the way I do characters because people like my characters. It's not a conscious decision. It's just what I do. But now I've got control over the world, and so the systems of the world, the socioeconomic systems, the church, the magic, all of that is intertwined in a way that's much more relevant to the stories I'm telling, because they were built for the stories I'm telling. And, you know, The Demon Awakens, that whole series, was really based on Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose and the Sarah McLachlan song, Building a Mystery. Those are the two inspirational points for me for writing Demon Wars. You know, as a Catholic kid growing up in central Massachusetts, and this is what I know. And I've pulled a lot of people to Demon Wars from Drizzt, and almost every time they come back and thank me for it. They like Demon Wars.
That's awesome. Mr. Salvatore, your new book is called Maestro. It's the second in the Homecoming series. You said the third will be out this fall?
Yep, it's called Hero.
Hero, awesome.
Out in October.
And you said we can expect more Demon Wars in the future?
Yep, I'm working on a Demon Wars book right now.
Excellent.
As a matter of fact, I just took the prologue and gave it to Graphic Audio for a Humble Bumble I did on Demon Wars that's running. Yeah, I'm working on it now. I'm working on a book called The Coven, which I haven't contracted it to anyone yet. I don't know. I don't want deadlines anymore. I don't want spec writing anymore. So when I'm comfortable knowing exactly when I'm going to finish the book, then we'll go out and we'll sell it. We've got a lot of interest, so we'll go out and find out the best way to put this out there.
Excellent.
I expect it to be out in 2017.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to send everybody to go pick up a copy of Maestro, and I picked up a copy yesterday. I have read the first Homecoming book and loved it, and ready to dive into this one. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you did, please go to iTunes and rate the show. Give us 5 stars or whatever you think it deserves. And while you're there, please leave a comment. Also, remember, Author Stories Insiders get access to the shows early. So go to hankgarner.com and click on the Insider link, and you can subscribe. It's only $10 a year, and have access to our super secret forums where we talk about upcoming shows and get early access. Thanks for listening.